History often tells us that John D. Rockefeller became powerful because he was efficient, disciplined, and unusually skilled at building businesses during America's industrial rise. But that explanation becomes deeply insufficient once we examine how consistently his power survived public outrage, legal attacks, and political reform. What if Rockefeller's true genius was not oil extraction or corporate organization, but the creation of a system where prices could be influenced without direct ownership, courts could be pressured without overt corruption, and public opinion could be guided without obvious censorship? What if the most important part of Rockefeller's strategy was not what he owned, but what he quietly shaped around him? And what if the financial pressure people feel today, rising prices, legal systems that seem inaccessible, and media narratives that feel strangely aligned with corporate power, can be traced back to methods perfected more than a century ago? Before we continue, take a moment to ground this investigation in the present by answering a simple question. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments. And if you want the unfiltered truth about how economic power survives scrutiny by reshaping the systems meant to restrain it, this is the moment to subscribe, because this documentary examines influence that rarely leaves a paper trail. At the dawn of the 20th century, John D. Rockefeller stood at the center of an economic empire that reshaped how Americans produced energy, transported goods, and priced everyday necessities. Standard Oil controlled nearly 90% of U.S. oil refining by the late 1890s. The conventional explanation for this dominance focuses on efficiency, scale, and technological coordination. Yet this account omits a crucial dimension: how control over pricing mechanisms allowed Rockefeller to influence markets far beyond his direct ownership. By coordinating rail transport rates, refinery output, and regional supply chains, Standard Oil could lower prices just long enough to eliminate competitors. Once they were gone, it could then stabilize prices at levels that favored its long-term dominance rather than short-term competition. This approach appeared legal, rational, and even beneficial to consumers in the short term. But it quietly transformed pricing from a market outcome into a strategic weapon. When competitors tried to challenge this system, they faced not only economic pressure, but also legal resistance. This resistance often unfolded in slow, expensive, and exhausting court battles, which disproportionately favored those with deep financial reserves and extensive legal networks. Rockefeller didn't need to win every case outright. The process itself discouraged opposition, delayed enforcement, and drained rivals of resources long before judgments were even reached. The courts weren't controlled in a crude or conspiratorial sense. They were influenced through precedent, legal saturation, and the normalization of arguments that framed consolidation as efficiency and dominance as inevitability. At the same time, Rockefeller understood that legal outcomes and economic policies don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by cultural assumptions, political pressure, and media framing. To address this, Rockefeller and his associates invested heavily in shaping narratives through newspapers, academic institutions, and philanthropic foundations. These investments framed industrial consolidation as progress, not predation. By funding universities, research institutions, and public interest organizations, Rockefeller's influence extended into the production of knowledge itself. He ensured that future lawyers, economists, and journalists were trained within frameworks that viewed large-scale organization as natural and desirable. This strategy didn't silence critics directly, but it changed the environment in which criticism was evaluated. It often recast systemic concerns as emotional, uninformed, or simply resistant to progress. The public was encouraged to trust institutions rather than question them. This pattern didn't end with the famous breakup of Standard Oil in 1911. The dismantling of a corporate structure did not dismantle the ecosystem of influence that surrounded it. Rockefeller's holdings were redistributed across dozens of successor companies, financial institutions, and trusts, many of which retained overlapping leadership and shared incentives. On paper, ownership appeared fragmented, yet coordination persisted. Prices continued to stabilize around preferred ranges. Legal pressure dissipated, public narratives softened, and as the United States moved toward global conflict in 1917, this ecosystem would prove more powerful than any single corporation could ever be. When America entered World War I, the federal government required unprecedented coordination between industry, law, and public opinion. Wartime economies simply cannot function without stable prices, predictable legal authority, and widespread public compliance. Rockefeller's network was uniquely positioned to meet these needs. Energy prices required management to avoid unrest. Legal authority required legitimacy to enforce controls. Media narratives required discipline to sustain morale. Each of these elements already existed within systems Rockefeller had helped shape over decades. The war didn't interrupt his strategy, it accelerated it. And the institution that quietly harmonized price stability, legal authority, and narrative discipline into a single operational framework would soon reveal just how untouchable Rockefeller had become. By the time America jumped into World War I, the question wasn't whether the Rockefeller empire had power. The real question was how that power worked so incredibly well without looking like it controlled any one thing. The secret sauce was a strategic alignment that turned economic muscle into systemic leverage. It made prices, court rulings, and public opinion all move in the same direction, almost like magic, with no visible puppet master pulling the strings. The big shift happened when massive industrial scale met financial armor and cultural acceptance. Rockefeller's businesses and their successors didn't just set prices because they owned everything. Instead, they shaped the very conditions for pricing by controlling raw materials, transportation, and access to money. This setup created narrow hallways for prices to move in. For the big players, it meant stability. For any newcomers, it meant chaos and volatility. During the war, keeping prices stable was sold as a patriotic duty. But stable didn't mean fair. It meant predictable profits for the huge suppliers and squeezed margins for smaller competitors, who just didn't have the cash to survive long periods of price controls. Government boards and wartime commissions needed data, logistics, and cooperation. Who did they turn to? The very companies already tangled in Rockefeller's industrial web. They basically outsourced enforcement to the people who had the most to gain from the outcome. Then you have the courts, which provided another layer of protection. Rockefeller's legal game was all about precedent, delay, and making things as complicated as possible. This turned the justice system into a war of attrition, where time and money were on the side of the giants. Even when antitrust lawsuits were successful, they dragged on 4 years. By the time a ruling came down, the market had already consolidated even more, and the challengers were broke. The legal outcome was important, but what mattered more was simply outlasting everyone else. At the same time, Rockefeller's influence was shaping what the public thought. The media narrative during the war was all about unity, efficiency, and the need for expert management. These themes just so happened to perfectly match the goals of large-scale industrial coordination. If you criticized this consolidation, you were painted as a troublemaker. If you questioned the price controls, you were unpatriotic or just didn't get it. This environment didn't exactly sense a disagreement, but it definitely pushed it to the fringes. And here's the twist. None of this required some kind of shadowy, top-down control. Prices just followed the logistics. The courts just followed procedure. The media just followed the money and the access. Each system looked independent, but all their incentives pointed in the same direction. The real institution that synchronized all of this linking industry data, legal power, and public messaging into one smooth operation wasn't a single company or a newspaper. It was a coordinating structure that turned private power into public policy, all while maintaining plausible deniability. To really get how this worked, let's break down the mechanics in three key areas: pricing, law, and narrative. First, prices. Standard Oil and the companies that came after it didn't just influence prices by owning refineries. They did it by controlling the inputs and the pathways that determine supply. By the late 1890s, interests linked to Rockefeller had their hands in nearly 90% of refining capacity. They got special, cheaper rates on railways and coordinated a national system for storage and distribution. This meant price changes weren't about what the market wanted, they were about logistical decisions. It allowed the dominant firms to take short-term losses to wipe out competitors, and then stabilize prices at levels that guaranteed them healthy profits. During the war, this whole logic went into overdrive. Demand for fuel skyrocketed for ships, trains, and factories. Government contracts naturally went to the companies that could promise massive volume, on-time delivery, and full compliance. Price ceilings were put in place to stop public outrage over profiteering. But guess what? Those ceilings were set using cost data provided by the biggest suppliers themselves. So, for the incumbents, the profit margins were still great. But for smaller producers with higher costs per unit, it was a struggle to even stay afloat. Between 1917 and 1919, while energy output grew like crazy, the consolidation in transport and refining only got stronger, tightening control through sheer scale, not just direct ownership. Second, let's look at the courts. Rockefeller's legal shield was built on the combined effect of precedent, confusing jurisdictions, and endless delays. After the 1911 breakup of Standard Oil, ownership was spread across many successor firms, all embedded within larger financial networks. This created a moving target for anyone trying to sue them. A single case would require massive amounts of discovery, expert witnesses, and long, drawn-out appeals, all things that favored defendants with bottomless legal budgets. And even when a court ruled against a specific practice, the underlying market structure, the real source of their power, was left untouched. The numbers really tell the story here. Major antitrust cases often took 5 to 10 years to finally resolve. In that time, market shares could shift permanently. The legal costs for challengers would balloon into millions of dollars. For the dominant firms, though, litigation was just another predictable cost of doing business. The court system didn't need to be corrupt, it just needed to be slow. Third, there's media and the public narrative. Rockefeller's strategy here was all about building legitimacy through philanthropy, education, and access. By funding universities, research institutes, and public awareness campaigns, foundations linked to Rockefeller shaped the very words used to talk about industrial organization. Suddenly, efficiency, coordination, and expertise were the ultimate virtues. In contrast, decentralization and small-scale competition were framed as inefficient, old-fashioned ideas. Media coverage during the war pumped up these themes. Newspapers and magazines depended on access to government officials, on data provided by industry, and on advertising dollars from large corporations. So, stories that promoted stability and scale were given top billing. Systemic critiques that questioned the whole setup, they struggled to get any airtime. This wasn't censorship in the classic sense. It was just an alignment of incentives. The financial current that tied all of this together was credit. Banks provided the cash that allowed large firms to withstand price controls and long legal battles. The Federal Reserve, created in 1913, made sure these systemically important institutions always had access to liquidity in times of stress. This reinforced the idea that their stability was the same as national stability. Between 1917 and 1920, consumer prices shot up by more than 30%, but real wages didn't keep up. The costs were shifted onto everyday households, while the big institutions remained protected. This is what you call moral hazard, in its most sophisticated form. When your size guarantees you'll survive, and your alignment with power guarantees you're seen as legitimate, risk doesn't just disappear. It migrates away from those who create it and lands on the shoulders of those least able to handle it. This whole mechanism didn't need a cinematic conspiracy with secret meetings in smoky rooms. It just needed aligned incentives, repeated practices, and normalization over time. Prices moved within managed boundaries. Courts moved at the speed of procedure. Media moved in step with funding and access, together. These separate movements created a stable equilibrium that protected the insiders and locked out the challengers. The coordinating body that translated this alignment into policy, the one that harmonized the data, the enforcement, and the messaging, it operated quietly and effectively. And its role is almost never mentioned in the popular history books. The real story is wilder than you think. When the First World War ended, Americans were promised a return to normal. The extraordinary measures taken during the conflict were supposed to be dismantled. Market competition, a balanced legal system, and independent journalism were expected to just reappear. But this hope, however sincere, underestimated something crucial. It missed how profoundly the wartime alignment of prices, courts, and the media had reshaped the very foundations of economic power. The most important consequence of John D. Rockefeller's strategy wasn't a single legal victory or a price adjustment. It was the normalization of indirect control. He showed the world that you don't need to be an overt, mustache-twirling monopolist to get what you want. You could achieve dominance subtly, and people would come to accept it. By the early 1920s, a new consensus had formed. Large corporations were seen as necessary for stability. Complicated legal processes were just an unavoidable part of modern life. And expert managers, not the public, should be the ones shaping our understanding of the economy. Once these ideas took root, they became almost impossible to reverse. The system didn't need Rockefeller anymore. It just needed precedent. Think about it. When prices are influenced through logistics and massive scale, instead of backroom deals, who do you hold accountable? It's diffuse, it's ambiguous. When the courts are designed to move slowly, justice naturally favors those who can afford to wait, the ones who can pay for armies of lawyers to navigate the complexity. And when media narratives start aligning with powerful interests not through direct orders, but through funding, access, and professional norms, public debate narrows, all without a single law being passed to restrict free speech. These dynamics didn't just vanish when Standard Oil was broken up. They didn't disappear with the first antitrust laws. They simply migrated. They moved into new industries, new financial tools, and new institutional setups, adapting their language and technology to fit the times. Sound familiar? During the Great Depression, what did we hear? Price stabilization and financial protection were necessities. And what happened? Consolidation got even more intense. During World War II, coordinated production and a unified narrative returned, all under the banner of national survival. Fast forward to the late 20th century. Deregulation, combined with the power of scale, created institutions that were eventually deemed too big to fail, too important to disrupt. And today, in the 21st century, digital platforms, global financial giants, and massive media networks operate within frameworks that echo the very same logic Rockefeller helped perfect a century ago. The modern economy is faster, more interconnected, and far more opaque than anything Rockefeller could have imagined. Prices change in milliseconds, legal battles span the entire globe, and narratives travel instantly across our digital networks. These changes don't weaken the power of alignment, they magnify it. A small advantage in scale, access, or credibility can compound at lightning speed. So when a crisis hits today, a financial meltdown, a pandemic, a supply chain breakdown, the response often follows a predictable pattern. Authorities rush to emphasize stability. The largest institutions get bailed out or receive support, and the costs, they get spread across the rest of society through inflation, through rising debt, and through fewer opportunities for everyone else. The language has evolved, but the underlying structure remains eerily similar. The persistence of this pattern depends on one thing: denial. It depends on us treating each crisis as a unique, exceptional event, on believing that each government intervention is only temporary, on accepting each new concentration of power as an unfortunate but necessary evil, rather than the predictable outcome of a system designed to produce it. History shows us that this kind of denial is expensive. Systems that are built on borrowed time don't prevent a day of reckoning. They just postpone it, making the eventual fallout even worse. Rockefeller's truly shocking strategy wasn't a single brilliant move. It was a framework, a blueprint for how economic power could shape the world while appearing lawful, efficient, and even socially responsible. By aligning prices, courts, and media through subtle incentives, rather than direct commands, he created a form of power that was resilient to reform and insulated from public scrutiny. Understanding this history isn't about blaming one man. It's about recognizing how systems are designed to reward certain behaviors and normalize their consequences. Only by seeing the pattern clearly can we begin to ask the hard questions. Is the stability we get from this concentration of power really worth the long-term erosion of accountability and fairness? If this has challenged your assumptions, consider sharing it with someone who believes that our markets, courts, and media operate independently by default. Subscribe if you want to see more investigations into how historical strategies continue to shape our modern world. And as these familiar solutions keep reappearing with new technologies and new justifications, ask yourself one final question. Are we wiser now, or are we just walking the same old path in better suits? Thanks for watching.